The orientation chamber smelled like recycled air and quiet authority. 47 beings sat in tiered rows: Valorian, Keth, Draxi, two Sonari twins who shared a sensory lobe and therefore occupied one seat. And in the center of the lowest tier, slightly apart from the others, a human named Corporal Marcus Reyes sat with his hands flat on his knees, and his jaw set in the particular way a man sets his jaw when he has decided to be invisible. It was not working. He was the only human in the Galactic Coalition Integration Academy's Cohort 12. He knew this going in. The recruiter had told him plainly, which he appreciated. "You will be unusual," she had said, and she had the grace to let the word settle before adding, "Unusual is manageable." He had believed her, which in hindsight said something about the quality of his judgment at 26, or the desperation of a man who had been working fire suppression on a deep space mining rig for 3 years, and badly wanted something that was not that. The instructor was a Valorian named Facilitator Das. She was tall in the way that made tall seem like a failure of language, approximately 7 feet, slate-gray skin, 4 upper limbs, 2 of which she kept folded at the secondary joint in a way that read as bored patience. Her voice was a synthesized overlay on top of something that naturally clicked. The translator implant Marcus had received at intake rendered her in flat, crisp standard. "Good morning, Cohort 12. She didn't look at them. She was reviewing a data panel. "Today's practical module is Assessment Integration 3. You have reviewed your coalition history materials. You have studied the documented expansion of primitive species, the conflicts, the technological timelines, the assessed threat indices of pre-spaceflight civilizations. Today, you will demonstrate." She set the data panel down. She looked at them for the first time. Her eyes were entirely white, no iris visible, which Marcus had been briefed meant nothing threatening on Valorians. It was simply how their eyes were structured, but 3 weeks in, he still caught himself reading it as emptiness. Each cohort member will select one documented primitive weapon from the Coalition archive. You will demonstrate its function, its tactical limitation, and the psychological effect it produced in its era of deployment. You may use the archive's physical replication lab to produce a safe facsimile. You have 30 minutes to select and prepare. She clicked something on the panel. The ambient lighting shifted one shade cooler, which Marcus had learned meant the classroom was now in active assessment mode. Every word spoken, every action logged. He looked at the archive screen that appeared at his station. He thought about it for a moment. He was not an unreasonable man. He knew what the exercise was designed to do: teach them to analyze primitive civilizations with clinical distance, the way a medical examiner analyzes a wound. Tool as symptom, weapon as data point. He understood the pedagogical framing. He also understood what the archive listed under human. Pre-spaceflight weapons, Earth standard date 1900-2100. He scrolled through them. He did not touch the replication lab terminal. At the front of the room, Facilitator Das was watching without appearing to watch. She had done this exercise 14 times in the last 3 cycles. She had seen Keth students demonstrate compound recurve bows with 40-minute lectures on tensile physics. She had seen Draxi display percussion cap firearms with anatomically precise target impact diagrams. She had even seen a Sonari pair reproduce, at safe scale, an early fusion warhead casing, which had required 3 liability waivers and a note to the department head. She had never had a human in her cohort before. She was curious, in the flat professional way of someone who was curious about data, not about people. Marcus came back from the preparation alcove at the 28-minute mark. He had nothing in his hands. The other cohort members had elaborate displays. Veth, the young Keth male who sat 2 rows up, had a beautiful reconstruction of a flail, chain-linked, weighted, the kind of weapon that required about 4 years of training to not kill yourself with, and was already running through a demonstration sequence with fluid precision. Imri, One of the Sonari twins had a crossbow and was explaining trigger weight differentials to her sister with the focused calm of an engineer. Marcus had a Zippo lighter and an aerosol can. He set them on the demonstration ledge at the front of the room when his name was called. He stood beside them in his coalition gray uniform, which was the same uniform everyone else wore, and which had been made approximately 3 centimeters too short in the sleeve because someone in supply had looked at the human height data and done the math wrong. Facilitator Das studied the objects. Her 4 arms remained folded. "Corporal Reyes," she said, "please identify the primitive weapons you have chosen to demonstrate." "They're not weapons," Marcus said. "They're components." A pause that had weight to it. "Please elaborate." He picked up the Zippo lighter. It was a real one. He had been allowed to submit a personal items exemption during intake for one non-electronic personal object, and he had listed it as memento, deceased grandfather, non-threatening, which was both true and a technically complete description. He had used the preparation time in the alcove to acquire a can of standard pressurized atmosphere supplement from the environmental maintenance cabinet in the hallway. The label read Ambient Supplement, VELORIAN Comfort Blend, and had a small diagram of breathing passages on it. He held up the Zippo. "This is a mechanical friction ignition device, pocket-sized, existed in this approximate form for approximately 200 years of human history. Flint wheel, fuel reservoir, windshield." He turned it in his hand. "It produces a flame approximately 2 centimeters tall, burn temperature around 1000 degrees Celsius, sustained as long as there's fuel. 1 hand to operate, weighs less than 2 ounces. He set it back down. He picked up the aerosol can. "This is a pressurized canister of gas. In my era, these came in many varieties: paint, cooking spray, insect repellent, sunscreen, compressed air for cleaning equipment. The gas inside is dispensed when you press the valve. It comes out fast in a directed stream." He set that down too. He looked at Facilitator Das. "Separately," he said, "these are not weapons. Humans would not categorize either one of these as weapons in your archive. Your archive is correct. A Zippo is listed under ignition, consumer, and a pressurized canister is listed under utility, atmospheric. Neither has a threat index above 0.3. "That is accurate," said Facilitator Das. "Right." He picked up the Zippo again. He looked at the class. "I'd like to demonstrate what happens when a human being combines them." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something is about to happen that changes the air pressure of the situation slightly. "The safe replication protocol states," Das said carefully, "that demonstrations must use facsimiles that cannot produce actual combustion, electrical discharge, or projectile velocity above." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm not going to light it. I'm asking permission to demonstrate the mechanic." Another pause. She studied him. He had learned over 3 weeks that Valorians process permission requests with genuine deliberation, not bureaucratic delay, not hesitation, but actual consideration of consequence trees, which he respected even when it was slow. "Demonstrate," she said. He held up the lighter. He held up the can. He positioned them so that the nozzle of the can would, if depressed, direct its stream across the mouth of the lighter's open flame. He mimed pressing the valve. "Sustained directed flame," he said. "Range, approximately 1 to 3 meters depending on canister pressure. Duration, until the canister empties. Enough to ignite organic material, fuel, most natural fabrics, stored supplies." He lowered both. Early human soldiers discovered this on accident, then rediscovered it on purpose, then built dedicated versions that weighed 40 pounds and had fuel reservoirs and ignition mechanisms integrated. They called them flamethrowers. You have those in the archive under human, incendiary deployment systems. Threat index 7.4. He set both objects on the ledge. But they didn't start there. They started here. He gestured at the Zippo and the can. Two objects with a combined threat index of 0.6. He stepped back. Facilitator Doss's white eyes were on him with an expression that, after 3 weeks, he was beginning to learn to read. It was not approval. It was not disapproval. It was the expression a data analyst makes when data does something interesting. "Your point," she said, "regarding these objects." "My point," Marcus said, "is about threat assessment methodology." He had thought about how to say this for approximately 30 minutes. Not during the prep period. He had thought about it before he ever walked into the room that morning, the way he thought about most things. In the flat, ruminant quiet that other people sometimes mistook for stupidity or passivity, and which was neither. The Coalition Archive assesses primitive civilizations on the threat index of their documented weapons. That's the baseline for Integration Academy curriculum. You study what they had and what it could do, and you calibrate your understanding of them accordingly. He glanced at the archive screen. Humans have a pre-spaceflight threat index of 4.2. That puts us in the lower third of recorded primitive civilizations. Below Keth, well below Draxi, below the early Sonari expansion fleets. By the numbers, we were a moderate problem. Several members of the cohort were looking at him now. Veth had his flail on the desk beside him and had turned fully in his seat. "The archive assesses documented weapons," Marcus said. "It doesn't assess the habit of mind that created them. It doesn't measure the cultural obsession with taking what's available and combining it into something that wasn't there before. It doesn't account for the fact that the most dangerous thing about a human being standing in a room has never been what they brought with them." He picked up the Zippo again. Just held it. "It's what they might think to combine while they're there." The room stayed quiet. Facilitator Doss said, "Sit down, Corporal Reyes." He sat down. He put the Zippo back in his chest pocket where it had lived for 4 years, since his grandfather's hands had placed it there at a funeral that Marcus had attended in dress uniform, because it was the closest thing he owned to looking like someone worth burying someone in front of. The assessment module continued. Veth demonstrated the flail beautifully. Imri demonstrated the crossbow. A Draxi female named Sor showed a percussion firearm with diagrams so precise they were almost architectural. Marcus watched all of it and took notes on his data slate and kept his hands still on his knees. After the module, Facilitator Doss dismissed them for midday interval. She did not call Marcus back, but when he passed her station on the way out, she said, without looking up from her panel, "Your assessment score for Module Integration 3 will be processed through the standard rubric." "I know," he said. "The standard rubric," she said, "awards maximum points for a weapon demonstrating the highest documented threat index in the archive." "I know," he said again. She looked up. "You will receive a 3.1 out of 10. "I figured." Her white eyes regarded him with that data analyst quality. "Why?" Marcus thought about his grandfather, who had worked coal for 30 years, and then retired to a small house in New Mexico, and sat on the porch every evening until he was 81, lighting a cigarette with the same Zippo he had carried since Korea, watching the desert go from gold to purple to black. His grandfather had never finished primary school. He could fix any engine ever made by human hands. He had never once in his life described a threat index, but he had understood, in the wordless way of people who paid attention to the world without being taught to, that the distance between a tool and a weapon was approximately the width of one bad decision, one desperate moment, one man standing in a room trying to figure out what he had. "Because I thought it was more important," Marcus said. Facilitator Doss held his gaze for 3 seconds, a long time for a Valorian. He had learned, and then looked back at her panel. He walked out. The Integration Academy was built in the coastal shear basin of Velos Prime's second continent, which meant that the walkways between buildings crossed over a body of water that was not quite sea and not quite sky. iridescent in a way that no human eye entirely trusted, because it didn't match any sky-water combination that evolution had prepared human eyes to process. Marcus liked it. He had liked strange light since he was 7 years old, and his grandfather had taken him to White Sands at night, and the alkaline flats had looked like a frozen sea under the moon, and he had understood for the first time that the world was full of things that were genuinely beautiful and also not quite right. He ate his midday meal alone at the outer tables, not because the others excluded him. They didn't. Most of them were courteous in the studied way of people who had been given cultural sensitivity modules, but because he was tired. 3 weeks into cohort life had taught him that being the only human in a room was more exhausting than it had any logical right to be, and that the exhaustion came not from hostility but from constant low-level translation. Not language, but everything else. The pauses, the body postures, the jokes that didn't quite land on either side, the moments when he reached for a reference point that didn't exist in anyone else's frame of reference. He was most tired after modules that required him to talk. Veth found him at the outer tables 14 minutes into the interval. The Keth male was younger than Marcus by several species years, which worked out to approximately 2.5 human years, and he moved with the elastic confidence of someone who had grown up in a body that was very good at being a body. He sat across from Marcus without asking, which was either rude by Keth standards or extremely familiar. Marcus hadn't figured out which yet. "That was interesting," Veth said. "Thanks. You're going to get a bad score." "I know. Why did you do it?" Marcus ate a bite of the carbohydrate block that the cafeteria assured him was nutritionally complete for human physiology. It tasted like the memory of bread, in the way that things synthesized to taste like other things sometimes carried only the ghost of the original. He had learned not to think too hard about this. "Because the lesson they're trying to teach us is wrong," he said. Veth was quiet for a moment, processing. "The threat index methodology." "The threat index methodology," Marcus nodded. "It tells you what a civilization had. It doesn't tell you what they'd think of next, and the gap between those two things is the actual danger." He paused. "Or the actual value, depending on what you're assessing them for." "They're assessing us for integration," Veth said. "That's different." "Is it?" The Keth male tilted his head in the direction that Marcus was learning, meant consideration rather than dismissal. "You're saying the Academy is training us to underestimate human capability." "I'm saying the Academy is training everyone to assess capability based on the documented record, which is fine for most civilizations, because most civilizations are fairly linear. What they had is a reasonable predictor of what they'll develop. But humans," he stopped. "But humans," Veth said, when Marcus didn't continue. Marcus put down the carbohydrate block. He looked out at the iridescent water between the walkways, which was doing something that involved its surface behaving like liquid but also like light, and which human eyes kept trying to resolve into something familiar and kept failing. "Humans have a very specific cultural pathology," he said. "We are constitutionally incapable of seeing two things without thinking about whether they go together. It's not even intentional. It's reflexive. You show a human a problem and an unrelated object, and they will sit there in the back of their brain quietly testing combinations until something clicks. It's why we have duct tape. It's why we have gunpowder, which was invented by people trying to make medicine. It's why we took a compression cycle meant for refrigeration and invented the internal combustion engine." He looked back at Veth. "Your archive sees a Zippo and a can of spray and records their individual threat indices. A human sees the same two objects and immediately thinks about what happens at the intersection." Veth was quiet. "That's the thing your archive doesn't have a field for," Marcus said. "Human intersection thinking. The relentless, compulsive, can't-turn-it-off habit of wondering what two unrelated things might do to each other." You think that changes your threat index significantly. I think, Marcus said, that it puts us in a completely different category that the archive doesn't have a name for yet. He picked up the carbohydrate block again. He ate. Veth watched him. You're not worried about saying this. Why would I be? Because you're in an integration academy. The entire program is designed to assess whether primitive species can be usefully integrated into coalition society. The academic record becomes part of your service profile. You just told your facilitator on the record that her threat assessment curriculum is incomplete. Yeah. And you're not worried. Marcus considered this with the honesty the question deserved. He was, in fact, a little worried. He was also not the kind of person who had ever been very good at performing a version of himself that believed things he didn't believe. His grandfather had called this stubbornness. His academy entry evaluator had noted it on his psychological profile as low deference to institutional authority, high functional compliance monitor. His mother had called it her cross to bear, which she said with a smile she didn't always manage to keep small. Here's the thing about being the only human in the room, Marcus said. One of two things is true. Either humans are genuinely integrated into coalition society going forward, which means somebody needs to be honest about what humans actually are, not the archive version, the real version. Or humans are not actually going to be integrated in any meaningful way, in which case my grade on this module doesn't matter much anyway. Veth absorbed this, binary thinking. Sometimes things are binary. The Keth male looked at the iridescent water for a moment. My people have a concept, he said slowly, in the deliberate way that meant he was translating something that didn't have a clean standard equivalent. It translates roughly as the cost of the honest guest. The idea that when you invite someone who will tell you true things into your house, you have to be prepared to pay for what you learn. That's a good concept, Marcus said. We use it to explain why honest guests are not always popular. Also good. Veth stood. I'm going to recommend to Facilitator Das, he said, that your module score be submitted to the Curriculum Review Board along with your demonstration rationale. That's within cohort rights under Article 14 of the Academy Charter. Would you object? Marcus looked up at him. Why would you do that? Because, Veth said, in the tone of someone who had not quite worked out whether this was a compliment or an analysis, you are the most interesting person in Cohort 12, and I would like to see what happens. He walked away, elastic and self-assured, back toward the building. Marcus watched him go. He took out the Zippo and turned it in his fingers once, the way he always did when he was thinking, not to light it, just to feel the weight of it, the small mechanical certainty of the steel lid and the flint wheel, the thing that had lived in his grandfather's pocket for 60 years and still worked. He put it away. He finished his carbohydrate block. It still tasted like the memory of bread. The Curriculum Review Board met in one of the upper levels of the administrative tower, which Marcus was not expected to attend. He attended anyway, because Article 14 of the Academy Charter also stated that the cohort member whose work was under review had the right to statement, and nobody had told him this was optional, and he was, as his evaluator had noted, functionally compliant but low on deference to institutional authority. The board was 3 senior facilitators and an administrative coordinator who was also a Velorian, also very tall, also with the folded secondary arms. The administrative coordinator's name was Dessa, according to the name panel at her station, which struck Marcus as unusual because it was a Scandinavian human name, and when he asked, quietly, one of the junior staff members in the hallway told him that the name had been assigned by the translator when she joined the coalition's multi-species administrative corps, because her actual name was a sound that human vocal architecture couldn't replicate, and she had been given the option of a standard language equivalent. He found this interesting in a way, he couldn't quite articulate. Veth presented the review case. He was precise and organized about it. He had, apparently, spent most of the midday interval compiling a supplementary argument that included citations from 3 coalition historical incidents where threat index underestimation of a newly integrated species had resulted in significant operational miscalculation. 2 of the 3 incidents involved species that the coalition had assessed as low threat based on their documented weapon systems and had subsequently discovered were far more dangerous once they were given access to coalition infrastructure that they immediately began combining with things. Marcus had not known Veth had done this. He was grateful, in the specific way you are grateful when someone goes out of their way to be an ally before you know you need one. Facilitator Das presented the original assessment module rubric. She was factual about it, which he also respected. She did not advocate for the grade. She presented the framework and let the board evaluate the framework. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood up and said what he had been thinking about since the module. The Coalition's integration curriculum is built on a principle of categorical assessment, he said. You identify what a species had, you evaluate it against the documented record, and you place them in a threat tier. The tiers determine integration protocols. A species in Tier 2 gets different resources, different restrictions, different pathways than a species in Tier 6. He looked at the board. That's a reasonable system. I'm not criticizing the system. I'm identifying a gap. The board member on the left, a Keth senior facilitator whose name Marcus couldn't read on his panel from this angle, said, "Identify the gap." The gap, Marcus said, is between documented capability and combinatorial potential. Your archive documents what a species had at pre-contact. It doesn't document the cognitive style that produced what they had. And for species whose defining cognitive feature is combinatorial thinking, taking what exists and generating new things from the intersection, the archived capability is not a reliable predictor of post-contact development. Give an example, said the administrative coordinator Dessa, whose voice in Standard was very precise. The way people who learned it as a second or third language sometimes spoke it more cleanly than native speakers. Earth pre-contact had a documented incendiary weapons system called the flamethrower, Marcus said. Threat Index 7.4. Your archive codes it accurately. What the archive doesn't record is that the flamethrower was invented by a soldier in World War I who observed that burning oil floated on water and that a pressurized pump could throw at a distance, and he combined those 2 observations with a fuel tank and a pilot light. The original materials were things already present in military supply depots. The combination was the invention. He paused. At intake, I submitted a personal effects exemption for a Zippo lighter, and I obtained an atmospheric supplement canister from the environmental maintenance cabinet in the East Corridor. Combined, on the spot, in a prep alcove, with no access to specialized materials, I can demonstrate a functional analog of the primitive component that eventually became the flamethrower. My combined threat index per archive is 0.6. The result of combining the 2 objects is closer to 5. The room was quiet. Humans, Marcus said, have been doing this for approximately 300,000 years. We do not have a name for it because we've never had to name it, it's just how we think. But it has a systematic structure. We see an obstacle, we inventory the available environment, and we generate novel combinations until we produce a solution. We are not creative in the way the word is sometimes used as something special or rare. We are combinatorially compulsive. Every human is. It's not a gift, it's closer to a reflex. He looked at the board. The integration curriculum should have a field for this. Not just for humans, for any species whose cognitive profile prioritizes combination over specialization. Because right now, when you bring such a species into coalition infrastructure and give them access to coalition materials, you are not introducing a 4.2 threat index into your systems. You are introducing a 4.2 documented threat index with a combinatorial multiplier that you haven't calculated because you don't have the formula for it yet. He stopped. He had said what he came to say. The board member, whose name he couldn't read, said, "You're asking us to redesign the curriculum." "I'm asking you to add a field to the assessment rubric," Marcus said. "That's significantly less work." Something happened around the table that he had learned to read over the past 3 weeks as the multi-species equivalent of amusement. A slight relaxation of secondary limbs, a shift in posture register, the Keth facilitator's crest tilting a fraction of a degree. Even facilitator Das, who had been as opaque as a data wall for the entirety of the module, did something slight with the angle of her secondary arm fold. The administrative coordinator Dessa was looking at him with the kind of attention that was its own information. "Cohort 12's assessment integration 3 scores," she said, "will be reviewed. The curriculum implications of Corporal Reyes' presentation will be referred to the Academy's Integration Standards Committee." She looked at him. "Your score will be held pending review." "What does that mean in practice?" Marcus asked. "It means," Dosa said, "that a 3.1 is not yet on your record." He nodded, he thanked the board, he walked out. In the corridor, on the way back to the cohort's residential section, he passed a maintenance worker repressurizing a section of wall atmospheric regulation, standard procedure, and he looked at the canister in the worker's hand, and then at the work light clipped to the scaffolding and then away, quickly, because that was the thing about it. The thing he had tried to explain and that you could only really understand from inside. You couldn't turn it off. You saw the canister and the light and part of your brain was already quiet and involuntary, running the intersection test, and the only thing between the thought and any consequence was everything else that made you a person rather than just a mechanism: judgment, restraint, care, the long memory of a grandfather's hands placing a Zippo in your chest pocket and saying, "Keep it. It's been useful," and saying it like a sentence with a lot more sentences inside it. He kept walking. The Integration Standards Committee met 6 weeks later. Marcus was not invited to this one. He heard about the outcome from Veth, who heard about it from an administrative aide who Veth had apparently made friends with in the way that Keth made friends, which involved a level of social fluency that Marcus found genuinely impressive and slightly exhausting to observe. The committee had added a provisional field to the pre-contact assessment rubric. It was labeled CP, combinatorial potential, and it was currently only applied to 3 species in the archive. Humans, a deep-water species called the Kell whose documented history showed a nearly identical cognitive pattern, and a fungal network organism from the outer rim, whose method of resource allocation amounted to the same thing at a biological rather than cognitive level. Human CP score provisional 8.7. Combined with the existing threat index of 4.2 and run through the integration protocol matrix, this produced a recommended oversight category that was, as Veth described it with a degree of Keth understatement, significantly higher than where you were. "Higher is bad?" Marcus asked. "Higher means more attention," Veth said. "More resources, different pathway." He paused. "Also more concern from certain committee members." "Which committee members?" "The ones," Veth said carefully, "who think the gap between 4.2 and a CP-adjusted score of approximately 14 is a problem that should have been identified before humans were allowed into coalition space." Marcus absorbed this. "They think we're dangerous. They think the archive assessment of your species was incorrect in ways that have implications for the roughly 300 million humans currently living in coalition-proximate space." Veth tilted his head. "Some of them think this is a crisis. Some of them think it's an opportunity. The administrative coordinator, Dessa, is apparently in the second group." Marcus thought about Dessa, whose name was a human name given to her by a translator because her actual name was a sound human mouths couldn't make. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the review table, not with the data analyst quality, not with wariness, but with something that was closer to recognition. The way a person looks at another person when they have been thinking about the same problem from a different direction, and they have just realized it. "What does the second group want to do?" he asked. "Apparently," Veth said, "they want to develop a curriculum unit on combinatorial cognition and run it through all active integration cohorts. They also want to convene a working group on CP assessment methodology and bring in human consultants." He paused. "One of the consultants they've requested is you." Marcus sat with this for a moment. "I'm a corporal," he said. "First year. I got a 3.1 on Integration 3. "The 3.1 is still pending review," Veth said. "And apparently, the committee found your original presentation more methodologically significant than your facilitator's rubric gave you credit for." Outside the window of the residential section, the iridescent water between the walkways was doing its thing that human eyes didn't trust, the surface behavior that was light and liquid simultaneously. And Marcus watched it and thought about something his grandfather had said once, at White Sands, when the alkaline flats had been doing their moon-end mineral thing, and Marcus had been trying to figure out what it looked like, and not quite getting there. His grandfather had said, "Some things aren't trying to look like something, they're just what they are. You don't need to make it familiar. You just need to let it be what it is, and pay attention." He had been 8 years old. He had not fully understood it. He understood it better now. The working group convened in a building Marcus had never been in, one of the administrative research towers, not the teaching facility. The room had actual windows rather than display panels, which was uncommon, and through them the iridescent water light played across the ceiling in patterns that Marcus had stopped trying to interpret and had started simply watching. There were 9 beings in the working group. Desat chaired it. She was, he learned, not actually an administrative coordinator in the standard sense. That was her current function, but her career record in the Coalition Administrative Corps stretched back 30 years and crossed more integration projects than Marcus could count on the briefing document. She had overseen the Keth second wave integration. She had written the standard protocols for managing first contact transition periods. She was, by any reasonable assessment, someone who knew more about integration than almost anyone else in this building. She had a human name given to her by a translator. She used it without visible irony or resentment. When the group sat down and she opened the session, she said, without preamble, "We are here to build a better way of seeing. Not a new threat assessment, not a new restriction protocol, a better way of seeing what is actually there when a new species arrives in our systems." She looked at Marcus. "Corporal Reyes, your Integration 3 presentation framed this as a gap between documented capability and combinatorial potential. That framing is useful, and I would like to start there. Please walk us through the argument again, for those who have only read the summary." He had expected to be nervous. He wasn't. This was the thing about being the only human in a room for long enough. You stopped being nervous about the fact and started being whatever else you were, which in Marcus's case was someone who paid attention and had things to say. He walked them through it. He took longer this time, 40 minutes rather than 10, with time for questions. He talked about the history of human combination thinking, the specific moments where cross-domain synthesis had produced something that no linear development pathway would have reached. The discovery of penicillin from mold contamination, which was an accident that only produced a result because Alexander Fleming thought to wonder what the mold was doing to the bacteria. The development of radar by a physicist working on microwave beam weapons, who noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. The entire field of nuclear medicine, which emerged from people wondering what cancer cells and radioactive isotopes might do to each other. He talked about the Zippo and the Aerosol can again. He described the specific cognitive gesture of it, not the physical demonstration but the mental move. Here are two objects. They are unrelated. What happens at the intersection? He talked about his grandfather briefly. Just enough. The Zippo, Korea, 60 years of keeping it because it was useful. The specific way a man who had never been in any institution's archive said things with the entirety of his lived experience in the subtext. Dessa asked good questions. So did two of the other working group members. A Keth senior researcher and a Draxi analyst whose species had, Marcus learned, something resembling a parallel cognitive tendency that had produced a completely different pattern of technological development, and had also been underassessed by the archive for analogous reasons. At the end of the session, Dessa said, "The committee will draft a preliminary CP assessment protocol to be piloted in the next academy cycle. The protocol will be developed in consultation with this working group. Corporal Reyes, you will be seconded to this working group for the duration of the pilot development." He sat with that. "I'm still technically in cohort 12. Your cohort will continue. You will attend your cohort modules and attend working group sessions. Your grade on Integration 3 will be reevaluated under a revised rubric." She looked at him. "You will receive a 10 out of 10. That seems," he said, "politically motivated." Her eyes, the same translucent white of all Valorians, with the same quality of looking at something you couldn't quite locate, regarded him steadily. "It is academically accurate," she said. "The module asked you to demonstrate a primitive weapon, the tactical limitation of that weapon, and the psychological effect it produced in its era of deployment. You demonstrated two objects, the tactical potential arising from their combination, and an argument that the psychological effect of combinatorial thinking species on coalition threat assessment has been underestimated. You answered the question that the module was actually trying to ask." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," she said. "The committee is doing this because it is correct to do and because the gap you identified is real and has operational implications. You made a case." She paused. "That is what you were supposed to do. The Integration Academy exists to assess what you are actually like, not to confirm what the archive says about you. You helped us do that." Another pause. "That is not a small thing." He looked at the light playing off the ceiling from the iridescent water outside. The way it moved and didn't quite resolve into any pattern a human eye would find predictable. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Your name, Dessa, the translator gave it to you because your actual name can't be produced by human vocal architecture." He stopped. Does that bother you? Using a name that's someone else's translation of you?" She was quiet for a moment. He was learning that Valorian quiet, unlike human quiet, had very specific textures. This one was neither the data processing quality nor the something is happening quality, but something else. Something that might have been in a human, the pause before you say a thing you've thought about. "The translator," she said, "examined several human names for proximity to the tonal profile of my actual name. Dessa was the closest match. It is a name that means, in the language it comes from, something approximately translating to active spirit or one who moves." She looked at him. "I find I don't object." He nodded. He thought, she has been doing her own version of this for her entire career. Taking the materials of a multi-species coalition that wasn't designed with her in mind and finding what fits, finding what carries, finding the close enough match that is also true in its own way. Not assimilation, not compromise. Something more like the thing he had been trying to describe in the module, look at what's here, think about the intersection, find the thing that wasn't there before. Maybe that was what integration actually was, when it worked. He didn't say any of this. He stored it in the place where he put things that were true but not yet fully formed, next to the memory of alkaline flats under the moon, and the specific weight of a steel-cased Zippo that was not, by itself, a weapon, and the 60-year understanding that the most useful things were rarely singular. The working group met every 3 weeks for 6 months. Marcus learned over those 6 months that building a curriculum field was a different kind of combination than the ones he had been talking about, slower, more iterative, structured less by inspiration than by the grinding, necessary work of defining terms carefully enough that they meant the same thing to a Valorian, a Keth, a Draxi, and a human all at once. The first challenge was the definition of combinatorial potential itself. The initial draft used the phrase generative cross-domain synthesis, which the Keth researcher said was accurate but unmeasurable. The Draxi analyst proposed lateral material integration capacity, which Marcus said sounded like it described a warehouse. 3 sessions later, they had settled on a working definition that read, the tendency of a cognitive system to spontaneously apply knowledge or materials from one domain to constraints or problems in an unrelated domain, producing novel outcomes not predicted by either domain in isolation. It was correct. It was also, as Veth observed when Marcus read it to him over dinner, the most bureaucratic sentence in history. It's a committee document, Marcus said. They have to be able to cite it. It sounds like it was written by a machine that learned what language is, but not what it's for. Yeah, well, the machine could have learned that from most committee documents. Veth laughed, which for a Keth was a brief auditory event like a compression release that Marcus had learned not to be startled by. You've gotten more cynical. I've gotten more accurate, Marcus said. They're not the same thing. In my experience, Veth said, they are frequently the same thing, arriving by different routes. He wasn't entirely wrong. The second challenge was measurement. Threat indices were calculated from documented history, battles, weapons systems, territorial expansion records, energy output levels. You could assign a number because there were numbers in the record. CP didn't have a documented history in the same way. You couldn't look at a species per contact record and count how many times they had engaged in cross-domain synthesis, because the record didn't track that. It tracked outcomes, not the cognitive process that produced them. What the working group eventually developed, not without significant argument, 2 tabled proposals, and 1 session that Marcus attended via relay because he was in the middle of a standard cohort field rotation and physically couldn't be in the building, was an assessment instrument based on behavioral indicators. It asked intake evaluators to look at a species' technological timeline and search for specific patterns, accelerated development in unrelated fields following contact between isolated specialist groups, sudden capability jumps that weren't predicted by linear progress in any single domain, recurring instances where an accidental observation in one field was rapidly applied to problems in another. If those patterns appeared with high frequency, the species got a high CP score. If the timeline was mostly linear, steady progress within existing specializations, the score was low. It wasn't perfect. Desas said at the session where they finalized it, all assessment instruments are approximations. The question is whether the approximation is useful enough to improve decisions, not whether it is complete. Marcus thought about that for several days afterward. He thought about it in the context of the Academy's entire approach. The way the integration curriculum was fundamentally an approximation of what a species was like, designed to be useful for coalition decision-making about contact and resource allocation and oversight levels. No assessment instrument captured a species completely. The archive's original threat index didn't capture humanity completely. The CP field the working group was building didn't capture humanity completely either. What it did was capture something real that the previous framework had missed entirely. And something real was more than nothing. Something real was, in fact, significantly more than nothing. He told Desas this one afternoon, after a working group session, when they were both still in the room and everyone else had left, and the light through the windows was doing the low-angle thing that made the iridescent water look like hammered copper. She listened. She considered. She said, There is a principle in coalition administrative theory that is sometimes called the adequacy threshold. The idea is that a framework does not need to be complete to be adequate. It needs to be sufficient for the decisions it is being used to make. She paused. The threat index was adequate for a coalition that was primarily managing territorial contact and resource disputes. The CP field makes it more adequate for a coalition that is managing cognitive integration. The question of what different kinds of minds do when they share the same systems. Cognitive integration is a bigger problem than territorial contact, Marcus said. Yes, she said. It is the actual problem. It took the coalition approximately 200 years to understand this. We are, as a multi-species institution, not always fast learners. He looked at the copper water. You've been in this institution for 30 years. 34. And you still think it can learn. She was quiet, the light moved. I think, she said, that it has learned significantly in ways that are visible if you have the comparison point. She looked at him. I have the comparison point. I was present for some of the things it learned from. She paused again. The work is never finished. The institution is never adequate. The adequacy threshold is not a destination. It is a direction. You move toward it. That is the work. Marcus thought about that. He thought about Desaz's 34 years in an institution designed by and for beings whose physiology, cognition, and social logic were not her own, in which she had spent 3 decades moving toward adequacy, adjusting frameworks, finding the close enough match that was also genuinely true. He thought about the CP field and about threshold adequacy, and about the specific kind of stubbornness that keeps a person at the work when the work is large and slow and imperfect. He thought about his grandfather, who had spent 30 years underground in coal with a lighter in his pocket, and who had walked out of that tunnel every day into light that was not quite the light of anywhere else, and who had called it beautiful, specifically because it was not familiar, specifically because your eyes had to work to take it in. Okay, he said, then let's keep moving. She did something with the secondary fold of one arm that he had come to recognize, after 6 months, as the Valorian equivalent of a nod. They went back to work. The pilot cycle ran for 8 months, 3 cohorts, 59 students across species. The CP field was applied in addition to the standard threat index, and the intake evaluators used the new behavioral indicator instrument to score every cohort member species on arrival. Humans scored highest. This was expected. The Kel scored second, which was also expected. A species called the Melori, new to the Academy, only recently admitted to coalition proximity, small in population, and previously assessed as low threat based on a limited documented history, scored third, which was not expected and produced a minor administrative incident when the Integration Oversight Board reviewed the pilot data and noticed that the Melori's CP score suggested they had a combinatorial potential significantly higher than their small population and minimal per-contact technological record had indicated. The incident resolved into a recommendation for expanded Melori integration support, which was the correct outcome, and which would not have been the outcome under the previous framework. Desaz recorded this in the pilot evaluation report as preliminary evidence of identification benefit, one confirmed case of assessment gap correction enabling improved integration outcome. It was a restrained sentence. Marcus had learned to read restraint in her writing as something like emphasis. He was listed as a contributing researcher on the report. Not as the originator of the idea, the working group had built the framework together, and the framework was genuinely a collaborative product that was better than what he had walked in with, but as a contributing researcher. His name, in standard, in a coalition administrative document. He stared at it for a moment when he saw the draft. He was 27 years old. He was a specialist in the Coalition Integration Academy's first graduating cohort, that included a formally adapted CP assessment field. He had a 10 out of 10 on Integration 3. He was also in the same document described in the species column as Human Earth Sol System, CP, 8.7 Threat Index, 4.2 Combined Integration Coefficient, 14.1 Tier, Monitored Active Subclassification, High Contribution Potential. He read that too, for longer. High Contribution Potential. There was a Zippo in his chest pocket that was older than the Coalition's formal contact with humanity. There was a grandfather's silence in the specific weight of it, the silence of a man who had spent 60 years being exactly what he was without any framework telling him what that was worth. There was a white sands night in there, and alkaline flats, and the patient observation of a man who had taught him, without any curriculum, that the most important thing you could do when looking at something unfamiliar was to let it be what it was and pay attention. He thought, "Grandpa, they have a field for it now." He put down the document. He was smiling, and it was a complicated smile, the kind with multiple layers that all arrived simultaneously and didn't quite resolve into a single feeling, which was familiar. His sister had once told him his face was like a poorly organized filing cabinet, everything technically present but not easily accessed. He had taken this as a compliment. He saved the document. He went to the next working group session. Cohort 12 graduated 14 months later. The ceremony was in the open courtyard near the iridescent water, and the light did its usual untranslatable thing across the assembled graduates and their families, who for the most part were attending via holographic relay from their home systems. Marcus's family was on a screen that was propped on a chair in the front row, because the relay tech couldn't replicate a human-configured holographic projection on such short notice, which he found funny in a way he didn't explain, and which his mother didn't quite understand, and which his younger sister understood immediately and laughed at before their mother could stop her. The graduation speaker was the curriculum board's chair. The speech was about service, integration, the ongoing project of a coalition that kept getting larger and keeping working the standard material, delivered well. Marcus stood at his place in the cohort row and listened. He thought about the past 14 months. The working group had developed, piloted, and provisionally adopted the CP assessment field. It was now standard in intake processing for 3 species and under consideration for 4 more. The curriculum had been updated, including a new module, Integration 3A, which existed alongside the original Integration 3, and asked cohort members to consider not just what a primitive civilization had documented, but what their cognitive patterns suggested they would develop given access to new materials. Several facilitators had protested. A few had engaged with genuine interest. Facilitator Das had written a 7-page supplementary analysis of the flamethrower development timeline and submitted it to the Standards Committee without comment, which Marcus had decided to interpret as her version of acknowledgement. Veth had graduated at the top of the cohort. Nobody was surprised. He had also started what he described as an informal study group on cross-species cognitive topology, which was either going to become a significant research program or collapse under the weight of its own ambition, and which had 12 members including Marcus and the Draxi analyst from the working group. After the ceremony, Desai appeared at his elbow. She was not attending in an official capacity. He had learned over 14 months, an unusual habit of showing up at things she wasn't officially attending. "Corporal Reyes," she said, "congratulations." "Thank you," he said. "It's just Reyes at this point. I got promoted 2 months ago." "Specialist Reyes," she said, without hesitation, in the way people who pay attention to detail don't need to be reminded twice. He looked out at the iridescent water. The light was doing something particularly complex today. The angle of Velo's prime sun was cutting through the surface behavior at a direction he hadn't seen before, and the ceiling patterns that resulted were different, moving differently. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "The CP field. The way we framed it in the working group. We're still treating it as a threat-adjacent metric, potential for dangerous novel combination, which is accurate but incomplete." Desai looked at the water too. "Incomplete how?" "Same cognitive reflex that produces a flamethrower from a lighter, and a spray can also produce penicillin from bread mold and a cure for river blindness from a veterinary antiparasitic." He paused. "The CP field is combinatorial potential. That's not inherently dangerous. The archive has been treating the output of combination thinking through a threat lens because threat is what the archive was designed to assess. But the same metric, applied to integration, is about something else entirely." "Contribution potential," Desai said, "not a question." "Yeah," he looked at her. "The species you most want in your coalition aren't the ones with the highest threat index. They're the ones who, when you put them in contact with everything you've built, are going to combine it with what they brought and generate things that weren't there before, things you couldn't have got to on your own." He thought about what he wanted to say. A CP score of 8.7 is not a warning. It's an offer. She was looking at the water. The light moved across her gray face in patterns that human eyes couldn't quite track. "You should write that down," she said. "Specifically, in a proposal format, address it to the curriculum board and copy the Integration Standards Office." "You're the Integration Standards Office?" "Yes," she looked at him. "So copy me." He reached into his chest pocket. The Zippo was there, still there, weight and steel and 60 years of use. He didn't take it out. He just held the shape of it through the fabric for a moment, the way you hold something you're not thinking about but also can't stop being aware of. "Okay," he said. His mother was waving from the screen propped on the chair in the front row. His sister was making a face that he translated across the distance of interstellar relay as a very specific expression meaning, "You should actually call us more." He raised a hand at them, and the expression on his mother's face shifted into something that was a whole sentence in itself. The particular way parents look at their children, when the children are doing something the parents had hoped for but never quite dared to say. He put his hand down. He thought about the proposal he would write, clean, specific, methodologically sound. He thought about the CP field as it existed and the CP field as it could be. Not an alarm, not a flag in the system, but a genuine measurement of what a species would add to the larger thing once you trusted them with the materials. He thought about two objects on a demonstration ledge. He thought about what happened at the intersection. Around him, Cohort 12 was dispersing into the afternoon, into postings and assignments and the ongoing project of whatever they were going to be. The iridescent water moved between the walkways, doing the thing it had always done, which was to be simultaneously not quite sea and not quite sky, and entirely, stubbornly, precisely itself. He took out the Zippo, he turned it once in his hands, he put it back. He went to find paper. There was always paper somewhere if you looked. That was the thing about having a coalition's worth of materials around you. The intersection was never as far away as it seemed. You just had to look.